A bitterly cold chill flooded in as the bus doors wheezed open with a tired groan. Daniel pulled his coat collar up and over his face to shield himself from the breeze. This was his stop. Stepping off at his stop, along with 7 others, each landing on the damp pavement, one after the other, he looked up into the dark October sky and stretched. It was a long day for our man. His eyes met the streetlights as he looked down. He then smiled as they flickered, somewhat rhythmically. They just couldn't decide whether they wanted to stay on or just give up entirely, he thought to himself. This place is a dump, at least it's kind of aesthetic, he said. His body ached from another long shift at the warehouse, and all he wanted to do was get home and to nuke some overly processed slop and lose himself in the brain-rotting nonsense you find on the telly. The day had already drained whatever patience he had left, but it wasn't over yet. As he walked the short distance from the dingy bus stop with the smashed-out windows to his estate, he couldn't help but notice the heightened police presence on the streets. It was all because of recent public disorder throughout the country, throughout the world. Our man just kept his head down and walked against the biting wind. He barely noticed the man stumbling forwards towards him until they both collided. The impact jolted him back to reality. "Oi, watch where you're walking, man," he barked, more out of reflex than malice. He recoiled with disgust the moment he actually got a good look at the man's face, which was pale, gaunt and sickly. The man didn't respond, not with discernible speech anyway, just muffled grumbles as he staggered on his way, coughing violently into his fist. The sound of his wet, rattling coughing was a clear indication that he wasn't just being affected by a rough night out, but that this man had caught a bad case of it. The sickness that had spread like wildfire, that is. Daniel looked back at the guy, all hunched over like he was carrying the weight of the world upon his shoulders, and for a second he felt a twinge of pity, but there was nothing he could do, except lift his eyebrows and shrug his shoulders, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets, and hurry along as the estate loomed ahead. The familiar sight of the tower blocks, graffitied splattered walls, broken windows, patched up with wooden boards, greeted him like an old friend. A right bloody depressing thing it was, but it was his home, his little piece of the world. One thing that couldn't help but be noticed on that night was the ambulance parked outside. A lot of people have been getting awfully sick lately. Even our man had an extreme fever just a few weeks ago. Most get over it. Some are lucky and don't get it at all. But a fair number of folk were getting real bad. Hospitalizations and some even being sent to quarantine camps. Walking past the ambulance and into the block, punching the button for the lift, and feeling the grime of thousands of unwashed hands beneath his thumb. It groaned in protest as it crawled down and then back up again to the 4th floor. As our Daniel exited the lift and waddled down the hallway and got closer and closer to his own flat, he saw a paramedic standing in the doorway of one of the neighbours' apartments. His name was George. "Is he alright in there?" Daniel asked. The medic turned around. An older man, with a shaved head and greying beard, said very blankly, "He's gone, lad." Our Daniel didn't know the man well, but he was still a neighbour, someone who he would say good morning to. But of course, the news just added another shovel on top of the mountain that was accumulated throughout that day. He just shut his mouth and said no more, and continued on to his own door. It was such a stubborn thing. Our man had to jiggle the keys a few times before it finally clicked open. He stepped through the borders of the door, closing it firmly behind him. His flat was a tiny space, but it was his own little corner of this world, and so he cherished it. "Oh man, what a day," he murmured, kicking off his black boots and tossing his jacket onto the worn-out sofa before making a beeline for the kitchen and raiding the fridge, grabbing the first ready meal he could find and shoved it into the microwave. While it spun around, our man headed for the shower, letting the hot water wash away the grime and stress and stink of the day. By the time he was done, the microwave beeped, and he fished out the steaming plastic tray. The smell was vaguely familiar, but it didn't matter to him. Food was food. He settled down on the sofa and muttered a quick prayer, one of those half-hearted ones that Nan used to make him pray. He chewed away in his dimly lit living room, clicking through the channels, his thumb resting on the remote, mindlessly flicking from one program to another, soap operas, reruns, until finally he stopped on the news. The presenter's serious tone caught Daniel's attention. Civil unrest has erupted across multiple cities again tonight. This comes after a month of rising tension. Protesters say they are frustrated with the government's handling of the recent pandemic sweeping the nation. This now marks the 5th night of protests that have turned violent, with reports of clashes between civilians and law enforcement in 12 different cities so far, as more people succumb to IV-277. He chewed slowly, eyes glued to the screen. Our man himself had IV-277. It all started over a month ago in September. A few people getting sick here and there. Then it just spiraled into a worldwide pandemic. It starts with coughing, then fever, nothing too strange at first, but then it gets worse. A lot of people just shook it off. Daniel was one of them, but some people don't. Hospitals were packed. They still are. People started talking about it being more than just a bad flu. Something new, something different. The government messed up big time, practically ignoring it at first. When they started rounding people up, dragging them out of their homes, if they showed any signs of severe symptoms, like clouding of the eyes and vomiting blood, that's when the real trouble started. Protests, riots, and chaos. Every day it felt like the world was losing its mind a little bit more. People stopped reporting cases out of fear that their family members would be taken away. Our Daniel looked on in disgust at the state broadcaster, and switched off the news, not wanting to hear any more of it. Enough doom and gloom for one night, he thought. He finished his food and tossed the tray onto the table and slumped back onto the sofa, rubbing his face with both of his hands, his eyes hot and heavy. He let them close, the dim flicker of the television being the only light. He eventually nodded off. When Daniel awoke, the room was still dark except for the TV that was still on, but it was showing something new. Red letters flashed across the screen, bold and urgent. State of emergency declared in the city. It was all kicking off outside, blinking and rubbing his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, mingling with shouts and screams echoing up from the streets below. He got up onto his feet and walked over to the window, peering through the grimy glass. The scenes outside were madness. People running and fighting, some smashing shop windows, others grappling with the police. Blue lights flashed, bathing everything in an eerie glow. It looked like a war zone. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him back. The screen was flooded with notifications, text, missed calls, 34 from Jerome alone, let alone all the others. Bro, where are you at right now? Have you not seen the carnage? Our Daniel texted back, fingers clumsy, still waking up. I just woke up, man. I'm looking at it right now. Another night of chaos, what of it? Jerome's reply came almost instantly. Nah man, it's hell on earth. Check the videos I sent you, lad. He scrolled through the notifications, tapping on the first video link that Jerome had sent. Our man's breath caught in his throat as he watched the footage. Armed police, firing on people. Military trucks lined up outside what looked like one of the makeshift camps they had set up for the sick. Soldiers, fully armed, their face obscured by helmets. In one video they were herding people into the back of trucks like cattle. Then suddenly chaos erupted, shots rang out, and the soldiers began to fire into the crowd, and people began dropping like ragdolls. But the worst was yet to come. The next clip showed something that made his skin crawl. Bodies, lifeless and bloodied, lay scattered on the ground, some in piles, others slumped against the fence. And then, one by one, they started to move. Slow, twitchy movements at first, like they were struggling to wake up from a bad dream. Then they rose, dragging themselves up with jerky, unnatural movements. Those people then launched themselves at soldiers and police, and anyone else nearby. Teeth bared, clawing and biting, the soldiers panicked, firing wildly, but it didn't stop them. The dead didn't care, they just kept coming. He watched in stunned silence, heart hammering away in his chest. This couldn't be real. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but it was real. He checked the rest of the videos that Jerome and others had sent him, and it was more of the same. Riots, dead people rising, the military losing control. Panic was spreading fast. Our man couldn't watch anymore. He turned off his phone, throwing it down, as if that would make everything go away. What the f*** is happening, he thought, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. A moment of calm came upon him as he remembered his mother and his friends, and immediately he grabbed his phone again and called them. He looked back out the window, the street still in chaos, but it was different now. There was a new kind of fear in the air, a sense that the world had changed and it was never going to be the same again. As he stood there frozen, The sound of the city's unraveling filling the night. A feeling rose within him. Whatever it would be worse than anything ever seen before. This was only the beginning. The door to Daniel's apartment burst open with a loud crash and slammed against the wall. 3 men stumbled inside, barely managing to stay on their feet. Their lungs burned with each ragged breath. Muscles screamed from the sprint up 4 flights of stairs. Daniel was the first one inside, followed by Jackson and then Peter, who scrambled through the doorway, slamming it shut with a heavy thud that echoed through the hallway. The sound of the lock clicking into place was like music to their ears. Our man collapsed onto his hands and knees, completely exhausted, gasping for air. His heart pounded against his ribs. The 3 of them were soaked in sweat, their clothes clinging to them like a second skin. Pete slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands, his chest heaving. "That was way too close," Jackson blurted out, still breathless. He leaned against the wall, running a shaky hand through his matted hair. "There's so bloody many of them out there." Daniel tried for a response, but the words failed him as they were caught in his throat. His mind was still reeling over what they had just been through. The streets are f***ing teeming with those things, man. He means the shuffling, reanimated corpses. Pete lifted his head, his face pale and drawn. "Maybe it's best if we head for one of those quarantine zones after all. It has to be a lot more safer than this," he said. Daniel shot him a look, half disbelief, half anger. "Are you mad? Have you forgotten what happened the last time they locked a bunch of people inside one of those camps? You watched what I watched, lad. We are not doing that," he said. "Yeah, no, Pete," Jackson piped up. "It's a powder keg, man. It's an illusion of safety. Some of the outbreaks even started in the camps." Our man gestured vaguely towards the window. Nah, we stay out here, Pete." Pete looked torn, chewing on his lip as he considered the options. "I just don't know. We're sitting ducks here, and how long before the food all runs out?" "Stop making hypotheticals, as you're just making your anxiety worse," Jackson replied. "We've just been chased by people who want to rip us apart. I think my anxiety is peak right now. I'm just trying to think ahead. You know, what do we do?" "What we do," Daniel said, standing up slowly, feeling the ache in his leg, "is make it out of this city and into the countryside. It'll be safer there, fewer people, more land." "I mean, yeah, it's a good idea, one that everyone and their mother has had, Daniel. But also, if you haven't forgotten, to get out of the city, we need to cross one of the bridges." Pete fired back, his voice tinged with frustration. "And all 3 have been closed, guarded by the military and armed police. They are not letting anyone through, Daniel. Heavy armed guards, I mean. I've seen them shoot at people just trying to get out. If we can make it sound, but if not, what then?" Jackson then added his 2 cents to this debate, his eyes darting nervously between the 2. "To be quite honest, lads, I think we are safe here, no? I mean, in the high-rise. All we need to do is block up the stairs and hold out. You can raid the other apartments for food. Also, those things are swarming the streets out there. We won't make it to the bridges. We can hold out here, and the army is holding ground, sort of." "Jackson, the army is losing ground by the minute," Daniel snapped back as he sat down on the beaten-up sofa. "Haven't you seen the news?" he continued, pointing at the TV. "They are not holding anything except us prisoner in this city. They're just delaying the inevitable, and you think we should stay here, in the middle of all this? Come on, lad, use your brain. And Jackson, we are not the only ones in this block of flats. I don't necessarily want to kill my neighbours over a can of fucking beans." They continued arguing for a moment, tempers flaring, but a decision was slowly being made. They just had to debate the pros and cons of all options. Jackson was right. The military in the city was holding ground and even in some areas gaining it, but the city had turned into a death trap. And Pete was right, food would run out eventually. "Alright then," Jackson said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We leave for the country." A quiet fell over the room as they all absorbed the weight of that decision. It was risky, but staying in the city was risky too. Maybe even suicide. "We need a plan then," Jackson said. Daniel wasted no time. He rose to his feet and disappeared into his room, coming back out a few minutes later, with an old army Bergen he used for hiking, placing it on the carpeted floor and rummaging through it before pulling out a map and placing it on the table. "Right," he began, as he span a pen around in his hand. To get to the north, we take these streets. Not as much footfall there. We also take as many back streets and alleys as we can. When we reach the edge of the city, we head into the forest. It'll be harder for the military to detect us. Also here, he pointed with the pen to a spot in the river. Right there is a spot that is more shallow. It'll be up to our chests, but we can get across it. Wait. Walk the river? Pete looked at Daniel like he had lost his mind. You know how cold that water is going to be. We will freeze before we even make it halfway, Daniel. Jackson nodded slowly, the gears turning in his head. Stepping forward, he added, Nah, hold up. We can take 2 sets of clothes and change once we get on the other side. Dan, is this map of all of Hampshire? He asked. Yeah, of course, plus I have more maps in the bag. Good, Jackson replied. It'll make it a lot more easier to find an old farmhouse or something. Lay low until the whole thing just blows over. If it blows over, Peter muttered, but he didn't argue any further. They had rested for a few hours, though none of them truly got any sleep. Every noise from outside or the slamming of doors made the trio jump. The eerie sound of shuffling feet out in the hallway also kept them awake. Daniel laid on his sofa, staring up at the ceiling, thinking, we'd seen things over the past few days that I'd never be able to unsee. People turning on each other, the dead coming back to life. The world is breaking down faster than we can comprehend. There was no more normal, he thought. In the earliest hours of the morning, they rose up, gathering what little supplies were left. Cans of beans and bottled water, anything that might help. Weapons were crude, bats, knives, hammers. It wasn't much, but then it was better than nothing. Dan slung his old Bergen over his shoulder, feeling the weight of it pressing down upon him. The sky outside was still dark. And it wouldn't get light until around about 6. They moved quietly, slipping out of the flat one by one, then down the damp and cold stairwell, the smell of rot hanging in the air. They had to be careful. The other route was packed with the dead. They'd seen them there, crowding the halls, banging on doors, drawn to the faintest noise. They took the stairs down and down, slowly, listening to every crack and groan. The flickering lights above made everything feel like a bad dream. Jackson led the way, holding his bat tightly, his eyes scanning for any shadows. Daniel brought up the rear, his knife ready in his hand. Peter was in the middle, holding a hammer like it was his lifeline. When the not-so-merry trio reached the bottom floor, they paused, ears straining for any sound of movement. It was quiet. They peered through the glass door at the entrance, checking for any signs of the dead. The streets outside were deserted, at least on this side of the block. It's all clear, Daniel whispered, and Jackson nodded, easing the door open just enough for them to slip out. The roads were littered with debris, abandoned cars and broken glass, the remnants of a life that no longer existed. They kept their heads down, moving quickly, but cautiously, every step taking them closer to the edge of the city and the uncertain safety of the countryside. As they slowly made their way north, Daniel couldn't help but glance back at his tower block, his little slice of the world, its silhouette, stark against the night sky. It had been home for him. Now it was just another tomb. He turned away, gripping his knife a little tighter. They had a long way to go, but they were moving. As the trio got deeper and deeper into the city, the night became alive with the sounds of chaos. Gunfire echoed in the distance, the sharp crack of rifles mingling with the rhythmic thud of helicopters cutting through the night sky, each step heavy with caution. The streetlights were still working. Above they flickered sporadically, casting eerie pools of light. They mostly stuck to the shadows, keeping low and moving slow, always mindful of the dead lurking just beyond the corner of vision. Jackson kept his eyes forward, bat clenched tight in his grip, while Daniel now took the lead, and Peter fell behind, but only ever just slightly. He had twisted his ankle a little. As they were leaving the tower block, their hearts hammered in their chest every time they crossed a stretch of road. Bloody hell, this is taking forever, Jackson muttered under his breath as they kept moving down a narrow alleyway, the faint glow of a distant fire lighting the sky. It'd have taken me 10 minutes to get this far on a normal day. We've been out here for nearly 20 already. Well, it's not exactly a normal night, is it? Daniel said, wiping the sweat from his brow. Every noise, every rustle of the wind set his nerves on edge. We're almost halfway there. Peter glanced around nervously. Well, it's not just the dead I'm worried about, he said. It's the living too. You've seen these lads out there, the ones with the guns. They're worse than the dead sometimes. He wasn't necessarily wrong. It wasn't just the dead they had to worry about. Gangs of thugs have taken to the streets, looting and terrorizing anyone who crossed their path. With the army struggling to keep order, parts of the city had turned into a no man's land, ruled by whoever had the most firepower. They had heard stories of people being robbed, beaten, or worse. The city was eating itself alive, along with the rest of the country and the world. Peter paused for a moment and called out to the other guys, looking back with a conflicted expression. Maybe we should turn around, go back to the tower block. We are not going to have this conversation again. What do you want to go back to? To starve and die? Or get picked off when we run out for food? Daniel shook his head. We stick to the plan, north and out. It's our only shot now. You really think it's better out there? Peter asked, his voice tight. We don't know what's waiting for us just past the river. At least on this island we're cut off from the rest of the country. Peter whispered. Shut up. No more bickering. We are sticking to this plan. Peter sighed and nodded reluctantly. All right, let's keep moving. They carried on their way, ducking through the back streets and alleys, without running into anything more dangerous than a stray cat. That's when something did go wrong. They were crossing another side street, this one completely blackened. No street lights illuminated the road ahead. When Peter tripped on a loose piece of concrete, he caught himself before he hit the ground, but the clatter echoed through the night, loud as a gunshot. Daniel turned, his heart sinking, just in time to see the shadows across the street start to shift. Oh shit, Jackson whispered, his voice trembling. We've got company, boys. It was dark out, but there was still enough light from the moon to illuminate the shadowy figures staggering towards them. Some were so close you could see the grey skin and blank eyes, mouths hanging open. One of them let out a low, grueling moan that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, and then, from behind it, more and more would come. All of them stumbled into view, drawn by the noise. 1, 2, 10, 20, a whole entire horde. Run! Daniel shouted as they took off, sprinting down the street as fast as they possibly could. The dead followed relentlessly, their heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. They zigzagged through the back streets, but no matter how fast they ran, they kept coming, driven by unholy hunger. The trio burst out and onto the main street, stumbling over abandoned cars and debris. More of them were out there, roaming aimlessly, until they caught the sight of them. The street filled with the noise of shuffling feet and desperate guttural cries. Daniel sunk his knife deep into the skull of one of them that got too close, the blade biting deep. Jackson was beside him, his bat smashing skulls with sickening crunches, and Peter swung his hammer wildly, keeping them at bay, but they were relentless. This way! Daniel shouted as he spotted a narrow alleyway cut between two buildings. They barrowed down it, the horde of the dead close behind. At the end of the alley, a rusted metal ladder clung to the side of a building, leading up to the roof. Daniel was the first one upon it, scrambling up as fast as he could. Then Jackson was right behind him. Daniel was almost at the top when Peter screamed. He looked down and saw one of the dead, an old man, his face half gone, clamped upon Peter's leg with its rotting teeth. Blood sprayed from the wound as Peter kicked frantically. Pulling his leg free, he climbed up the rest of the way, limping badly, and they hurled him onto the roof just as the last of the dead reached the base of the ladder. Jackson and Daniel stared at Peter, their faces pale with horror. His leg was bleeding badly, a jagged bite mark oozing crimson. Peter was slumped against the wall, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. "You've been bitten," Jackson said. Peter looked down at his leg. Reality sank in. "I know." His voice was small, almost lost against the night. Daniel ripped off his jacket, using it to bandage the wound as best he could. Blood seeped through the fabric, but it was the best they could do. They were safe from the dead, for now, but the sight of Peter's leg, they knew that he was now a ticking time bomb. "Well, what do we do now?" Jackson asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel said, his mind racing. "We keep him alive. Maybe he's going to be okay." Peter looked at them, his eyes filled with fear. "Daniel, don't. We all know what happens. We've all seen it." Before they could say anything more, the sound of a door cracking open cut through the tense silence. Daniel spun around, knife in hand, ready to fight. a figure stood in the doorway leading to the building's stairwell. An older man, unshaven, wearing a ragged coat and holding a flashlight. "Don't just stand there," he said, his voice carrying a gruff, urgent edge. "Get in here, or do you plan on standing up here all night?" Jackson grabbed Peter under his arms, and Daniel his legs, lifting him as gently as they could. They hurried through the door, the man slamming it shut behind them. He locked it with a heavy bolt and turned to them with a tired smile. "Name's Timothy," he said, gesturing for them to follow him down the dimly lit stairwell. "You guys look like you can use a little shelter." They descended the stairs, Timothy leading the way. The air was thick with a musty scent of dust and old wood. As they reached the top level of what looked like to be an old department store, Daniel realized that they wasn't alone. There were dozens of people all gathered there, huddled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. They looked up as they entered, their eyes narrowing when they spotted Peter's bandaged leg. A woman in the corner pointed, her voice rising in alarm. "He's been bitten. Get them out of here!" People scrambled to their feet, picking up whatever they could find. Pipes, chairs, anything that could be used as a weapon. Jackson and Daniel instinctively raised theirs in response, adrenaline flooding through their veins. "Calm down." Anthony, stepping between them and the crowd. "He's hurt, yes, but he's not turned. Not everyone turns right away. Some don't turn at all." A middle-aged man in the back scoffed. "That's complete bull. You know what happens. They all turn eventually." Another voice piped up, softer but firm. No, he's right. I've seen it myself. Some people, they don't change. Maybe they're immune or something. He could be too." The room fell silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Timothy gestured for all to lower their weapons. "Look, if it makes you happy, we'll keep him in a separate room, just to be safe. But nobody is going to kill this boy. Not if I can help it." Slowly the others backed down, though their eyes stayed on them, distrustful and weary. Timothy led the way to his small room at the back of the store, far from the main group. He handed them some canned food and water, offering a weak smile. "Rest here for a bit. I'll keep an eye on things out there." The trio thanked him. It was hard to feel any comfort. As the night stretched on, Peter's breaths became more and more shallow and ragged, each one more laboured than the last. His skin, once a healthy pink, had turned into a sickly shade of grey, his lips dry and cracked. Jackson and Daniel sat beside him, helpless. There was nothing they could do as he slipped away. They tied his hands and his feet, just in case, but it felt cruel, like they were giving up on him before he had even gone. Maybe this was just a fever, but they all knew the truth. Peter had been becoming delirious for hours, mumbling in half-conscious rambles about home, family, and things they couldn't even make out. And then just like that, he was gone. A long final breath left his lungs, and his body stilled. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Daniel and Jackson just stared at his lifeless body, tears forming in their eyes. I cannot describe the anger that they were feeling. Daniel reached out to close his eyes, his fingers trembling. Jackson sat back, his face pale, staring at Peter's lifeless body as he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He blinked away the tears and setting his jaw right. They didn't have the luxury of mourning. Not really, not here, not now. Timothy appeared at the door, his expression somber. "I'm sorry about your friends, lads," he said softly, handing Daniel a worn-out bedsheet. "We'll need to wrap him up and get him downstairs, away from everyone else." Jackson and Daniel nodded and carefully wrapped Peter's body in the sheet, the fabric soaking up the blood from his wound. They carried him down the darkened stairwell, following Timothy to the basement, where the rest of the dead were kept. The room was cold and damp, and the stench of decay lingered in the air, clinging to everything like a second skin. They placed Peter gently on the floor, their friend reduced to just another casualty of this nightmare. The two knew what they had to do, but they just didn't have the heart to do it to their friend. And so Timothy took charge and pulled out his knife, plunging it into Peter's head to stop him from reanimating. Jackson broke the silence first, his voice choked with grief. "What do we do now, Daniel?" "We just stick to the plan," he said. "We are getting out of this city. We owe it to him." Timothy looked at them, with concern crossing his face. "You two should rest first, at least for the night. It's not safe to go out there, not now. Morning is brewing." "We are not staying here," Daniel said firmly. "We can't. We appreciate the help, but we've got to keep moving, north, and away from all of this." Timothy sighed reluctantly. "I understand, but just be careful out there, boys. Things are getting worse out there every day." Jackson and Daniel climbed the stairs and packed up their things in silence, collecting what little food and water they had. They moved with purpose, but every action felt heavier without Peter. As they headed for the door, a small group of survivors gathered around, whispering anxiously. Some of them had been eyeing them ever since they had arrived, watching with a mix of curiosity and desperation. A young man with a shaved head stepped forward, clutching a rusty crowbar. "You're leaving, right? Take us with you. We can't stay here anymore." Jackson shook his head. "We are sticking to a small group. We're not taking any of you with us." The man's face contorted in frustration. "You can't keep us from going. And plus, it's not safe here. We've got no supplies left, and those things are crawling all over the streets. We are dead if we stay." A woman with a dirty bandage wrapped around her arm joined in. "Please," she begged. "You've seen what's happening. Take us with you. We're better off in a bigger group." "No," Daniel said firmly, his voice cold and decisive. "You are free to go wherever you choose, but you are not coming with us." The gathered group erupted in angry mutters, but none of them dared to step closer. Timothy raised his hand, calming the crowd. "Listen to them. It would be suicide for a big group to go out there right now." Without another word being spoken, Jackson and Daniel turned and headed for the roof, leaving the group behind. The air was thick with tension, but no one followed them. They climbed up onto the neighboring building, leaping across a narrow gap, their footsteps echoing softly on the rooftops. Below them, the dead still lingered in the alley, aimlessly wandering about. They moved quickly, navigating the rooftops until they found their way down behind a row of shops. The alley seemed clear, and they took it as a good sign, continuing on their journey north through the city. Halfway down one narrow street they were spotted again, a group of the dead, shuffling out of a side passage, their hollow eyes locking onto them with mindless hunger. Jackson and Daniel bolted, ducking low and sliding under a row of parked cars, holding their breath as the dead passed by, inches from where they had hid, their feet dragging along the pavement, and the foul stench of rot filled their noses. They waited, motionless, until the last of them had moved on. Daniel peeked out from under the car, and the coast was clear. He looked back at Jackson and whispered, "Let's go!" And they crawled out from underneath the cars, sprinting the last stretch towards the edge of the city. They snuck through the forest, making sure that there were no patrols of the army, and finally they made it to the river, its dark waters stretching out before them like a final barrier. They used the trees and bushes for cover, and spied the opposite bank for any military patrols. The last thing that they needed was to be shot on sight by some panicked soldiers. "Right there," Daniel said, pointing towards the part of the river that they can cross. The other side was so close. All they had to do was cross it. They slipped into the waters, the icy cold shocking their systems. The current was strong, but they pushed forward, kicking hard until they reached the opposite bank. Jackson pulled himself up first, then helped Daniel climb the muddy slope. They were soaked in freezing, but for the first time in days, they allowed themselves a quiet and brief celebration. They took off their bags and rummaging through it for a moment and pulling out some dry clothes and put them on, and continued marching through the woods and out the other side into a residential area. They had officially made it off the island city. The neighborhood on the other side was a ghost town. Empty windows, abandoned cars. It wasn't the countryside yet. They'd still have to make it through this part of town before they found any safety. Daniel and Jackson, still wanting to avoid the dead, decided that leaping over back garden fences would be a great option. But they could only go so far before they met another main street, and of course looking over, there were still many dead roaming. "There," Jackson whispered, pointing to a block of flats with the door hanging open. "We can take shelter in there," he continued. They hopped over the fence with staggering speed and sprinted for the entrance. But just as Jackson reached the other side of the road, one of the dead lunged from behind a parked van. It grabbed his shoulders and sunk its teeth deep into his arm. Jackson pulled away and screamed, swinging his bat wildly. But more of them closed in, dragging him to the ground. He cried out Daniel's name, eyes wild with panic. "Help me! Help me!" he screamed, but there was nothing Daniel could do. He turned around, ready to fight his way back to his friend, but there were too many. Jackson's screams filled the night, his body completely disappearing beneath the horde. Daniel's feet felt like lead, every instinct screaming for him to go back, but it was too late for his friend. He was gone, and so he turned back around and ran for the flat, heart pounding, and slammed the door behind him. just as the dead reached the threshold. Their bodies crashed against the metal, rattling the frame, but the door held. He stumbled backwards, collapsing onto the cold floor, tears streaming down his face. "Oh shit," he said over and over again. The little room he was in was completely pitch black, and the only sound were his ragged breaths and the relentless pounding of the dead on the other side of the door. He sat there, knees pulled up to his chest, numb and shaking, Jackson's cries still echoing in his ears, mingling with the noise outside. A cruel reminder of how close they had come. Our man was alone, in the dark, with nothing more than a thin metal door, stopping the dead from getting in and tearing him to pieces. He raised his head. He tried to think of a plan of how to get out of there, but for now, all he could do was sit and listen to the sounds of death knocking on his door.